1944. The Pacific Ocean was a colossal chessboard where nations played with steel, fire, and the lives of men. For those American sailors and soldiers captured by the Empire of Japan, the game was over, and a personal hell was just beginning. In the notorious prisoner of war camps scattered across remote islands, survival was a currency measured in single grains of rice and breaths stolen from the suffocating grip of despair. Here, hunger, disease, and the casual brutality of the guards were the only constants. But what if I told you that in one of these God-forsaken places, a forbidden sound began to cut through the air? It was the sound of a purely American invention. What if I told you that one prisoner of war didn't just survive, but completely redefined his captivity, not with a rifle, but with a simple kitchen spatula? This isn't just another war story. This is the incredible, controversial, and almost unbelievable tale of how an American cook, to save his own skin, taught his sworn enemies how to make their most iconic dish and became their personal chef. Was he a hero of survival or a collaborator who feasted while his brothers starved? Get ready, because the truth is far more complicated and shocking than you can imagine. Before the world caught fire, Frank Miller was just a guy from Des Moines, Iowa. His battlefield wasn't some far-flung island. It was the sizzling griddle of his family's small diner. He wasn't a warrior. He was an artist whose canvas was a plate and whose paints were salt, pepper, and a little bit of love. His greatest talent was a simple one, turning basic ingredients into meals that tasted like home. Frank's world was one of comforting smells, frying bacon in the morning, simmering beef stew in the afternoon. He believed in the quiet power of a good meal to solve just about any problem. A hot cup of coffee could mend a broken heart, and a perfectly made cheeseburger was, in his opinion, the pinnacle of human achievement. The war in Europe and the troubles in the Pacific felt a million miles away from his peaceful Iowan kitchen. But then came December 7th, 1941. Like a shockwave, the news from Pearl Harbor rattled the entire country, reaching even Frank's quiet corner of the world. Suddenly, the fight wasn't a distant headline. It was a personal call to action. Driven by a sense of duty he couldn't ignore, Frank traded his white apron for a Navy uniform, believing his skills could be of use feeding the boys overseas. He was assigned as a cook third class aboard the USS Victory, a brand new destroyer. The ship's galley became his new domain. It was a chaotic, steaming, steel-clad world, a far cry from his cozy diner. But the principle was the same. He quickly earned a reputation not just for his food, but for his ability to make the men feel a little less lost, a little closer to home. His mashed potatoes were creamy, his gravy was rich, and his bread was always fresh. For the young sailors, many away from home for the first time, a meal from Frank's galley was more than just sustenance. It was a lifeline to the world they'd left behind. He was a morale officer armed with a ladle, and the crew absolutely adored him for it. He wasn't firing torpedoes, but he was fueling the men who did. As the USS Victory steamed towards the heart of the Pacific Theater, the reality of their mission began to set in. The drills became more intense, the lookouts more vigilant. Frank could feel the tension simmering just beneath the surface, a stark contrast to the bubbling pots and pans in his galley. He just kept his head down, focused on his work, and prayed he'd only ever have to fight with a tough cut of meat. He was a simple man whose only ambition was to return to Iowa and flip burgers for the rest of his days. He wasn't built for the violence and chaos of war. He was a creator of comfort, not a dealer of destruction. But fate, as it often does in times of war, had a cruelly different recipe in mind for Frank Miller. His entire world was about to be burned to the ground. Now, before we continue with this incredible story, please take a moment to support our channel. If you enjoy uncovering forgotten stories from history that challenge your perspective, hit that subscribe button. It ensures you won't miss our future deep dives. And don't forget to like this video and drop a comment below telling us what city and country you're watching from. The Philippine Sea in June 1944 was a death trap, The air was thick with humidity and the constant threat of enemy aircraft. The USS Victory was part of a massive fleet, a steel city on the water, but in the vastness of the ocean, Frank couldn't help but feel terribly small and exposed. He was below decks, preparing the evening meal, when the world turned into a symphony of violent noise. The general quarters alarm blared, a sound that cut through the clatter of the galley and chilled him to the bone. Anti-aircraft guns on the deck above began their deafening rhythm. Frank and his galley crew followed their training, securing what they could, their hearts pounding in their chests. The ship lurched violently as the first torpedo struck, throwing men and equipment across the steel floor like toys. It was pure, unadulterated chaos. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into a terrifying darkness punctuated by the red glow of emergency lamps. The screams of men and the groan of tortured metal filled the air. Frank wasn't a soldier. He was a cook. He was trained to handle a hot stove, not a sinking ship. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped him like nothing he had ever known before. A second explosion, much closer this time, ripped a hole in the side of the ship. Seawater roared into the compartments below. The order to abandon ship was screamed down the chain of command, a frantic, desperate cry against the din of destruction. Frank scrambled up the ladders, choking on smoke, his only thought being to get to the open air, to escape the steel tomb that was dragging him to the bottom of the sea. On the deck, the scene was apocalyptic. The sky was filled with smoke and fire. He saw faces he recognized, young men he'd shared a joke with just hours before, now lost in the desperate fight for survival. He didn't hesitate. He just ran and leaped into the oil-slicked, unforgiving water, the heat of the burning ship at his back. He clung to a piece of floating debris, watching in horror as the USS Victory, his home for the last year, broke in two and slipped beneath the waves. The sounds of battle faded, replaced by the lonely cries of the survivors scattered across the water. For hours they drifted, a collection of terrified, oil-soaked souls, praying for a rescue that might never come. As dawn broke, a shadow fell over them. It wasn't the reassuring silhouette of an American vessel. It was a Japanese destroyer, its flag a stark, terrifying symbol against the morning sky. There was no fight left in them. They were pulled from the water one by one, their relief at being saved from the sea instantly replaced by the grim certainty of what was to come. Stripped of his uniform, his dignity, and his name, Frank Miller was no longer a U.S. Navy cook. He was now a Horio, a prisoner of war. The enemy sailors looked at him not with hatred, but with a cold, detached indifference that was somehow even more frightening. He was no longer a man. He was property, a spoil of war. As the ship steamed towards an unknown destination, Frank looked out at the endless ocean. The world he knew, the world of diners and warm bread and friendly faces, had vanished. It had been sunk to the bottom of the sea along with his ship. His new world was one of captivity, and his battle for survival had only just begun. He had no weapon, no training, and no idea what horrors awaited him. All he had were his hands, calloused from years of working in a kitchen, and a knowledge of food that seemed utterly useless in this new, brutal reality. He was wrong. His simple, unassuming skill was about to become the most powerful weapon in his arsenal. After a grueling journey in the suffocating hold of the ship, Frank and the other survivors were herded onto a remote, jungle-choked island. Their new home had a name, Prisoner of War Camp 3B. It was less of a camp and more of a scar carved into the earth, a place designed to break men's bodies and, more importantly, their spirits. The air was heavy with the smell of mud, sickness, and defeat. The camp was a collection of dilapidated wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire, overseen by skeletal watchtowers. The guards, disciples of the brutal Bushido code, viewed the prisoners not as defeated soldiers, but as cowards who had dishonored themselves by surrendering. This philosophical contempt translated into a daily regimen of calculated cruelty and neglect. There was no mercy to be found in Camp 3B. The conditions were beyond inhumane. The barracks were dangerously overcrowded, with men sleeping on splintered wooden platforms. Mosquitoes, thick as a blanket, spread malaria and dengue fever with vicious efficiency. The single latrine was a stinking, overflowing pit that bred disease. Death wasn't a possibility here. It was an active, daily presence, stalking the skeletal figures of the prisoners. But the most effective torture, the one that ground them down day after day, was the relentless, gnawing hunger. The daily ration was a small bowl of watery rice gruel, sometimes with a few boiled weeds thrown in. It was barely enough to sustain life, let alone the will to live. Men became walking skeletons, their eyes sunken, their bodies withered away to nothing but skin and bone. For Frank, a man whose entire life had revolved around the joy and abundance of food, this was a special kind of hell. He would lie on his plank at night, his stomach a hollow, aching void, and torment himself with memories. He could perfectly recall the taste of a thick steak, the texture of his mother's apple pie, the simple, satisfying weight of a well-made sandwich in his hand. He watched as the lack of nutrition did its devastating work. Men succumbed to beriberi, their bodies swelling grotesquely. Scurvy caused their teeth to loosen and their gums to bleed. Dysentery swept through the barracks like wildfire, leaving men too weak to even move from their own filth. The camp doctor, a captured American, had no medicine and could do little more than offer a comforting word as men died. The guards seemed to take a sadistic pleasure in their suffering. They would often eat their own plentiful meals of fish, rice, and pickled vegetables in full view of the starving prisoners, their faces impassive. The psychological toll was immense. Men who had faced enemy fire with courage were reduced to bickering over a single spilled grain of rice. Hope was a foreign currency, with no value here. Frank saw the light go out in men's eyes. He saw camaraderie, the bedrock of military life, crumble under the immense pressure of starvation. It was every man for himself, a desperate, primal struggle for the next meager mouthful. The Frank Miller from Iowa, the cheerful cook who believed in the goodness of a shared meal, was being systematically erased, replaced by a creature of pure survival instinct. He realized a horrifying truth in the depths of his hunger-fueled despair. The Japanese didn't need to execute them with bullets or bayonets. They were being executed in slow motion, one agonizing calorie at a time. The kitchen, once his sanctuary, had become the ultimate instrument of their torture. He had to do something, anything, to fight back, even if it was a futile gesture. He began to observe. He watched the guards, he watched the jungle at the edge of the wire, and he watched the meager ingredients that went into their daily slop. An idea, born of pure desperation, began to form in his mind. It was a crazy, dangerous idea that could get him killed. But in a place where death was already guaranteed, what did he really have to lose? The breaking point for Frank came during a particularly grim week. The monsoon rains had turned the camp into a sea of mud, and a fresh wave of dysentery was claiming 2 or 3 men a day. The daily gruel seemed even thinner and more tasteless than usual, a grey, watery insult to the very concept of food. It was killing them, and Frank simply couldn't stand it anymore. During his work detail near the edge of the camp, he'd noticed some familiar-looking wild herbs growing just beyond the fence line. They were similar to wild ginger and lemongrass, things he'd experimented with back home when trying to replicate Asian-inspired dishes. A desperate plan began to hatch. It was a long shot, but it was better than doing nothing and watching everyone slowly fade away. On his next work detail, feigning a stomach cramp, he managed to crawl close to the fence and stuff a handful of the herbs into his ragged trousers. His heart hammered against his ribs. If he were caught, the punishment would be severe. But the thought of adding even a hint of flavor, a ghost of real food, to the prisoner's bowls pushed him forward. That evening, while assigned to the miserable task of stirring the massive pot of rice water, he saw his chance. The guard was distracted, berating another prisoner. With trembling hands, Frank crushed the herbs and dropped them into the simmering pot. stirring furiously to hide the evidence. It wasn't much, but the faintest aromatic scent began to rise with the steam. When the soup was ladled out, the effect was immediate. A few of the prisoners, their senses dulled by starvation, didn't notice, but others did. A confused murmur went through the barracks. The soup wasn't good, not by a long shot, but it was different. It had a hint of something other than despair. For a fleeting moment, a spark of curiosity lit up their hollow eyes. A man next to Frank, a tough Marine sergeant named Davis, whose body was failing him, took a sip, and his eyes widened slightly. "What is that?" he rasped. "There's something in it." It was the first time Frank had seen any expression on Davis's face other than grim resignation in weeks. For Frank, it was a small, triumphant victory against the overwhelming misery. But the act did not go unnoticed. One of the prisoners, a man known for currying favor with the guards, saw the exchange and reported it. He likely hoped for an extra spoonful of rice for his troubles. Before Frank could even finish his own meager portion, 2 guards stormed into the barracks and dragged him out into the muddy compound. He was accused of adulterating the rations, of attempting to poison the prisoners. The charge was absurd, but it didn't matter. He was beaten brutally, kicked and struck with a rifle butt until he was a heap on the ground. The physical pain was immense, but the pain of his failed attempt to help was worse. His one act of defiance had ended in disaster. As he lay there, spitting blood into the mud, he expected the beating to be the end of it. But then, the camp's imposing commander, a man named Tanaka, emerged from his quarters. The guards snapped to attention. Tanaka looked down at the crumpled form of the American cook with an expression Frank couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't just anger, it was curiosity. The incident of the soup of discord was over, but it had set something much larger in motion. Frank had inadvertently put himself on the radar of the one man who held the power of life and death over every soul in Camp 3B. His desperate attempt to add a little flavor to their suffering was about to change his fate in a way he could never have predicted. Commander Isoroku Tanaka was not a typical camp commandant. He was a career military man, stern and disciplined, a firm believer in the supremacy of the Japanese Empire. Yet he was also educated and had spent time in the West before the war. He held a deep, almost academic fascination with the culture he was now sworn to destroy. This internal conflict made him unpredictable and, in many ways, far more dangerous than a simple brute. He had the beaten and bruised Frank Miller dragged to his office. It was a sparse but clean room, a world away from the filth of the prisoners' barracks. On his desk, among military papers, were a few English books. Tanaka sat, calmly sipping a cup of tea, and studied the American cook. He wasn't interested in the accusation of poisoning. He knew it was nonsense. He was interested in the motive. "The guard tells me you put weeds in the men's food," Tanaka said in surprisingly good, if heavily accented English. "Why would you do this? An act of sabotage?" Frank, struggling to his feet, shook his head. "No, sir," he managed to say, his voice hoarse. "It wasn't sabotage, it was seasoning. I was trying to make it taste better, to make it taste like food." Tanaka raised an eyebrow. The concept was alien to him. Food was fuel, nothing more. For prisoners, it was a tool of control. The idea of adding something for the sole purpose of taste struck him as a peculiarly Western indulgence, a sign of the very softness he was taught to despise. He saw Frank not as a saboteur, but as a curiosity, a living artifact of this decadent enemy culture. "You Americans," Tanaka mused, more to himself than to Frank. "You boast about everything, your cars, your movies, your women, and your food. You believe it is the best in the world, don't you?" Frank, not knowing how to answer, simply stood there, his body screaming in pain. This was a strange, terrifying conversation he was completely unprepared for. The commander leaned forward, a strange glint in his eye. This was a game to him. He was bored with the grim routine of the camp, and this audacious cook presented a new kind of diversion. "I have heard stories about your American food," he continued. "Greasy, oversized, unsophisticated, a peasant's meal that you pretend is a delicacy. You are a cook. Prove me wrong." Frank was floored. He didn't understand what was happening. Was this a test? A trap? His mind raced. This powerful, cruel man was challenging him, not as a soldier, but as a cook. It was the only part of his old identity he had left. In that moment, a flicker of the old Frank, the proud diner owner from Iowa, pushed through the fear and starvation. What would you have me make?" Frank asked, his voice barely a whisper. The audacity of the question seemed to amuse Tanaka. He was used to prisoners begging for their lives, not asking for culinary assignments. This American was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Tanaka was beginning to suspect it was a bit of both. Tanaka stood up and walked to the window. Looking out over the miserable camp, he commanded, "Show me a dish that represents your America," he declared, his voice firm. "Show me this taste you prize so highly you would risk a beating for it. You will cook for me. If you impress me, perhaps your situation will change. If you fail..." He let the threat hang in the air, unspoken but perfectly clear. The challenge had been issued. It was insane. It was impossible. But it was also the first glimmer of something other than slow, inevitable death. Frank Miller, the beaten prisoner of war, was being given a chance to cook his way out of hell. But first, he had to make a promise so absurd it bordered on madness. Staring into the cold, calculating eyes of Commander Tanaka, Frank's mind was a whirlwind of panic and desperation. What dish could he possibly make? What food screamed America more than anything else? The answer hit him with the force of a physical blow, a taste memory so powerful it momentarily blotted out the pain from his beating. A hamburger, the king of his diner menu. "I can make you a dish," Frank said, his voice gaining a sliver of confidence he didn't feel. "It is the food of my people. It's a hamburger." He said the word, and it felt foreign and holy in this place. Tanaka tilted his head, unfamiliar with the term. "Habaga," he repeated, stumbling over the syllables. The commander's ignorance gave Frank a tiny, crucial advantage. Frank, seeing a sliver of an opening, pressed on. He knew he had to sell this. He had to make this strange, unknown food sound like a feast for the gods. "It is ground meat, grilled over a fire until it is juicy and savory," he began, his inner showman taking over. "We place it between two pieces of specially prepared bread, with sharp vegetables and a sweet and tangy red sauce." He was painting a picture with words, describing something so alien and decadent to the Japanese palate that it sounded like a myth. The officers with Tanaka listened, their expressions a mixture of disgust and fascination. Meat was a luxury, and the idea of grinding it up and serving it with bread and sauces was utterly baffling, a symbol of American excess. Seeing his chance, Frank made the bet of a lifetime. He knew survival wasn't just about impressing Tanaka. It was about securing the tools to survive. "But," he added, his voice low and steady, "to create this magic, this hamburger, I require specific ingredients. I cannot make it with the slop you serve us. It would be an insult to the dish." Tanaka folded his arms, a smirk playing on his lips. He was enjoying this. The prisoner was negotiating. "And what ingredients does your magic require, cook?" he asked, the word cook dripping with sarcasm. This was the moment of truth. Frank took a deep breath and listed the impossible. Beef, proper flour for bread, onions, tomatoes, and some form of vinegar. The officers scoffed. Beef was practically non-existent on the island, reserved for the highest-ranking officials on rare occasions. To give such precious resources to a prisoner for an experiment was unthinkable, but Tanaka was intrigued by the sheer audacity of the request. This American's arrogance was, in a twisted way, something he could almost respect. "You are a very bold man for a prisoner," Tanaka stated, his eyes narrowing. "You make a big promise. If this hamburger is as magical as you claim, you will be rewarded. But if you are wasting my time and my resources, the punishment will be far worse than the beating you just received. I will make an example of you." Frank's blood ran cold, but he held the commander's gaze. This was it, the point of no return. He had made a wild, desperate promise to recreate a piece of home in the middle of hell itself. His life now depended not on his strength or his will to survive, but on his ability to grill a perfect burger for his sworn enemy. "You will have what you need," Tanaka declared, making a decision. "Or at least what can be found on this miserable island. You will show us the taste of America." The craziest bet of the war had been made. Frank Miller was no longer just a prisoner. He was a chef with a single high-stakes item on his menu. Failure was not an option. The next morning, the camp buzzed with a strange new energy. Under the direct orders of Commander Tanaka, a bizarre expedition was mounted. 2 Japanese guards, their faces etched with confusion and annoyance, were assigned to Frank. He was no longer a prisoner on a work detail. He was the reluctant guide on a culinary scavenger hunt, and his guards were his deeply skeptical sous chefs. The first and biggest hurdle was the meat. As expected, beef was out of the question. It simply didn't exist in their stores. Frank's heart sank, but he had to improvise. He explained to the guards, through a mixture of gestures and broken English, that pork could work. It would change the flavor, but it was his only shot. Reluctantly, a small, fatty portion of salted pork was procured from the officer's private supply. Next was the bread. The camp's rations consisted only of rice. There was no flour, no yeast, no oven. This seemed like an insurmountable problem. Frank spent hours experimenting, his guards watching him with contemptuous curiosity. He eventually devised a painstaking method, boiling rice until it was a thick paste, mashing it with a rock, and then painstakingly shaping it into flat patties that he could toast over the fire. It wouldn't be a bun, but it would have to do. The search for toppings became a surreal trek through the local village just outside the camp. The villagers stared at the American prisoner and his armed escort, a sight no one had ever seen before. Frank pointed at root vegetables that resembled onions and strange bitter greens he hoped could pass for lettuce once blanched. He was a chef, shopping in the most alien grocery store imaginable. The biggest challenge was creating ketchup. Tomatoes were a fantasy. Frank, however, remembered the tangy, fermented foods common in the Japanese diet. He pointed to a reddish, pickled plum paste called umeboshi and a dark, salty soy sauce. He knew that with some rice vinegar and a little sugarcane he'd spotted, he could boil these ingredients down into something that might, if you squinted your imagination, resemble a tangy red sauce. This entire process created a tense, profane alliance. The guards, who had beaten him just days before, were now taking his orders. Find a flatter rock. More firewood. Chop this finer. They followed his instructions with begrudging obedience, all under the watchful eye of Commander Tanaka, who observed the proceedings from a distance with an unreadable expression. For the other American prisoners, this spectacle was a source of deep confusion and growing resentment. They saw Frank not laboring in the mud with them, but seemingly collaborating with the enemy, hoarding precious food. They didn't see his desperation. They saw privilege. Whispers of traitor and Jap lover began to circulate through the barracks, isolating him completely. Frank was caught in an impossible position. He was working not just for his own survival, but for a chance to potentially change things. Yet in doing so, he was driving a wedge between himself and the very men he hoped to one day help. The weight of their glares was almost as heavy as the rifle butts of the guards. Finally, after 2 days of frantic improvisation, he had all his components assembled. It was a bizarre collection. Hand-minced salted pork, flat rice paste buns, wilted jungle greens, pickled plum ketchup, and sliced root vegetables. It was a Frankenstein's monster of a hamburger, a culinary absurdity born of desperation and a madman's bet. He cleaned a flat piece of scrap metal to use as a griddle and built up his fire. The moment of truth was at hand. He was about to cook the most important meal of his life, a meal that would either elevate him from the pits of hell or seal his doom forever. The entire camp, prisoners and guards alike, seemed to be holding its breath. The stage was set in the center of the dusty compound. Frank arranged his makeshift kitchen with a focus and precision that momentarily transported him back to his diner in Iowa. The fire was hot, his ingredients were laid out, and he had an audience. On one side, the gaunt, hollow-eyed American prisoners watched with a mixture of hope, contempt, and sheer disbelief. On the other, Commander Tanaka and his officers stood with their arms crossed, ready to pass judgment. Frank took a deep breath to steady his nerves. He formed the minced pork into a patty, his hands moving with the familiar, comforting muscle memory of 1,000 burgers made in a different lifetime. He placed the patty onto the hot scrap metal. The sound, a loud, aggressive sizzle, cut through the tense silence of the camp. It was a sound of civilization, a sound of plenty, a sound that simply did not belong here. Immediately, a plume of smoke and an incredible aroma filled the air. It wasn't just the smell of cooking pork, it was the smell of fat rendering, of meat charring, of something rich and savory being created in a place defined by bland, watery starvation. For the prisoners, the scent was an exquisite form of torture. For the Japanese officers, it was utterly foreign and strangely alluring. Frank worked methodically, toasting his rice paste buns on the edge of the griddle, wilting his jungle greens, and preparing his strange concoction of plum ketchup. He was in his element. For these few minutes, he wasn't prisoner Euro 734. He was Frank Miller, chef. He moved with a confidence and purpose that had been beaten out of him weeks ago. He assembled the hamburger with the care of a surgeon. The toasted rice bun, the perfectly cooked patty, a smear of his tangy sauce, the wilted greens, and the sharp root vegetables. It looked bizarre, a caricature of the real thing, but it held together. He placed it on a clean tin plate, the only one he could find, and held it up. One of the guards took the plate and presented it to Commander Tanaka. The entire camp was dead silent. Every eye was on the commander. He picked up the strange creation, examining it from all angles, as if it were an unexploded bomb. He looked at the layers, the texture, the unfamiliar combination of ingredients. He looked over at Frank, whose entire life hung on this single moment. Tanaka brought the hamburger to his mouth and took a bite. The crunch of the toasted rice patty, the savory, salty rush of the pork, the sharp tang of the sauce, the slight bitterness of the greens. It was a combination of flavors and textures he had never experienced in his life. It was chaotic, bold, and completely unsophisticated, and it was absolutely delicious. His eyes, for a split second, widened in genuine surprise. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully, processing the barrage of new sensations. He took another bite, then another. The other Japanese officers watched their commander, their faces a mask of disbelief. He wasn't just tasting it, he was eating it. He was enjoying it. After he had finished the last bite, Tanaka delicately wiped his mouth. He stood in silence for a long moment, looking from the empty plate to the American cook standing before him, covered in sweat and grime. The fate of Frank Miller, and in many ways the entire camp, rested on the next words to come out of his mouth. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying across the compound. "Cook," he said, and for the first time, the word was not an insult. "You will make this again, tomorrow, for all of my officers." The bet had been won. The first hamburger in hell had been a resounding, earth-shattering success. Commander Tanaka's verdict echoed through the camp like a thunderclap. Frank's success was so absolute, so undeniable, that it fundamentally altered the power dynamic. He wasn't just the prisoner who could cook, he was the sole proprietor of a coveted new luxury. Tanaka, recognizing the value of this new tool for morale among his own men, wasted no time in making Frank an offer. He summoned Frank back to his office that evening. The atmosphere was entirely different. The previous air of menace was replaced by one of transactional business. "Your hamburger was a success, Tanaka stated, as if discussing a military maneuver. My men are pleased. This is a skill of value. He made it clear this wasn't about a single meal, but about a new arrangement. The offer was laid out with stark clarity. Frank would be relieved of all other duties. He would be given a small, segregated area to serve as his kitchen near the officers' quarters. He would be provided with a steady supply of the best ingredients the island had to offer: pork, fish, vegetables, rice, from the officers' own stores. His job, his only job, would be to cook exclusively for Commander Tanaka and his staff. In exchange, the benefits for Frank were life-altering. He would receive full rations, the same food the Japanese soldiers ate. He would be given a separate, cleaner sleeping space, away from the disease-ridden barracks. And most importantly, he would be granted Tanaka's personal protection. No guard would lay a hand on him without the commander's express permission. It was, in essence, a deal with the devil. Frank's mind reeled. On one hand, it was a guarantee of survival. No more slow starvation, no more random beatings, no more sleeping in filth. It was a golden ticket out of the hell he'd been living in. He could eat, he could regain his strength, he could live to see the end of the war. All he had to do was the one thing he was born to do: cook. But the other hand held the crushing weight of the moral cost. Accepting the deal meant officially separating himself from his fellow Americans. He would be feasting while they starved just a few hundred feet away. He would be serving the very men who were torturing and killing his countrymen. It was a pact that would save his body but could very well poison his soul. He looked at Tanaka, whose face betrayed no emotion. The commander saw this as a simple, logical transaction. He had a resource, and he was exploiting it. He didn't care about Frank's moral dilemma. He only cared about results. For Tanaka, it was good management. For Frank, it was a choice between life as a pariah and death among his brothers. The instinct for survival is a powerful, primal force. It can overwhelm principles, ethics, and even loyalty. After months of gnawing hunger and watching men die around him, the choice, as painful as it was, felt almost inevitable. He couldn't help anyone if he was dead. With a heavy heart and a knot in his stomach, Frank Miller accepted the pact. "I'll do it," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Tanaka gave a slight, satisfied nod. The deal was struck. Frank was immediately moved from the prisoner barracks to a small storage hut that would become his new home and kitchen. As he left the barracks for the last time, he could feel the burning hatred in the eyes of the other prisoners. He was now the Chef Horio, the official cook of Camp 3B. He had won his bet and secured his survival, but in the process he had crossed a line. He was no longer just one of the prisoners. He was now, in the eyes of his countrymen and perhaps even himself, the enemy's chef. The celebration of his success was short-lived, replaced by the cold reality of his new privileged isolation. Life for Frank Miller changed overnight, and the transformation was jarring. The gnawing emptiness in his stomach, a constant companion for months, was replaced by the unfamiliar feeling of being full. He ate rice that wasn't watered down, portions of grilled fish, and even the offcuts of the pork he used for the officers' meals. The simple act of eating a satisfying meal felt like both a miracle and a profound betrayal. His new quarters, a small hut adjacent to the officers' building, was a palace compared to the barracks. It was dry, relatively clean, and he had it to himself. For the first time in months, he could sleep without the sounds of men groaning, coughing, and dying around him. But the silence was its own kind of torture, filled with the loud, accusatory voice of his own conscience. As his body began to recover, the psychological toll of his new position mounted. He was completely and utterly alone. The Japanese guards treated him with a new, detached respect. He was the commander's asset now, but he was still the enemy. And his fellow Americans, they looked at him with a pure, undiluted hatred that was more painful than any physical beating. He became a ghost in the camp. When he had to walk through the compound, the other prisoners would turn their backs on him. The whispers followed him everywhere. Tora, the Japanese word for tiger, but also a homonym for traitor. Tanaka's pet. Look at him getting fat while we starve. He was a constant walking reminder of their own suffering and his apparent comfort. The most agonizing moments were at mealtimes. From his small kitchen, he could smell the savory dishes he was preparing for the Japanese. Pork with ginger, grilled fish, savory egg custards he had learned to improvise. At the same time, he could hear the weak shuffling of his countrymen lining up for their daily bowl of watery gruel. The contrast was a daily crucifixion of his soul. He tried to rationalize his decision. He was alive, wasn't he? What good would he be to anyone as another corpse rotting in the mud? This was survival, the brutal calculus of war. But the arguments felt hollow every time he saw the skeletal face of Sergeant Davis, the Marine who had been so impressed by his seasoned soup, now glaring at him with contempt from across the compound. The privilege was a cage. He ate well, but every bite tasted of guilt. He slept on a dry platform, but his dreams were filled with the accusing faces of his former comrades. He was safe from the guards' fists, but he couldn't escape the prison of his own mind. He had traded one form of hell for another, a cleaner, well-fed hell, but hell nonetheless. He had thought that getting enough food would be the end of his problems. He was naive. He now understood that a man could have a full stomach and still be starving for something else, for connection, for honor, for the simple nod of respect from a fellow countryman. He had none of that. He was an outcast, a collaborator in the eyes of the only people who mattered. He began to lose weight again, not from lack of food, but from the stress and guilt that gnawed at him day and night. The bitter taste of his privilege was poisoning him. He had made his deal with the devil to survive, but now he had to find a way to live with the man he saw in the reflection on his clean tin plate. Frank realized he couldn't just cook and survive. That wasn't enough. He was in a unique position, a man who could walk between two worlds, the world of the captors and the world of the captives. He had to find a way to use his cursed privilege for something more than just saving his own skin. He had to find a path to redemption. The kitchen hut, Frank's gilded cage, offered one thing his previous life did not: access. The Japanese officers over time grew comfortable around the quiet American cook. They saw him as a piece of furniture, a background fixture who produced delicious food. They began to hold their informal meetings and conversations over meals, assuming he couldn't understand their language or the context of their discussions. But Frank was a keen observer. He started to pay meticulous attention. He couldn't understand every word, but he began to pick up on key phrases, names of locations, dates, words for shipment, fuel, and ammunition. He started to notice the officers' moods. A tense, frustrated tone might mean a supply ship was late. An excited, celebratory mood could signal a successful military operation nearby. His kitchen became the most unlikely listening post in the entire Pacific Theater. While he was chopping vegetables or mincing pork for their burgers, he was also absorbing information. He learned about the camp's dwindling medical supplies from the quartermaster's complaints. He overheard Tanaka discussing patrol schedules and weaknesses in the island's defenses. It was a flood of raw, unfiltered intelligence. The challenge was what to do with it. He had no way to transmit this information to the Allies, but he could record it. Lacking paper and pen, he devised an ingenious system. He began to make tiny, deliberate nicks and scratches on the wooden handles of his kitchen utensils. A notch on the ladle might represent a fuel shipment. A scratch on the knife handle could be a date. His collection of pots, pans, and tools became a coded diary of the camp's inner workings. It was a dangerous game. If his system were ever discovered, he would be executed as a spy without a moment's hesitation. The constant fear added another layer of torment to his existence, but it also gave him something he desperately needed: a sense of purpose. He was no longer just the traitorous chef fattening up the enemy. He was a spy, fighting a silent secret war from behind his stove. This new identity helped him endure the glares of the other prisoners. He knew something they didn't. He was fighting back in the only way he could. This secret was his shield against the crushing guilt. He learned to perfect his act. He kept his eyes down, his expression blank. He became the quiet, obedient servant, never giving any indication he understood or cared about the conversations swirling around him. The Japanese officers became even more careless, sometimes leaving maps and documents open on the tables where they ate, just feet from where Frank was working. He memorized the coastline drawn on a map, the positions of gun emplacements marked with an X. He committed to memory the names of Japanese destroyers mentioned in conversation. He was building a mental dossier, a complete intelligence picture of the enemy's operations on this small but strategic island. The information was priceless, but it was trapped inside his head. The irony was profound. The very act of collaboration that had made him a pariah among his own men had given him the power to potentially save them. His proximity to the enemy, his greatest shame, had become his greatest weapon. He was playing a long game, gambling that he would survive long enough for this information to matter. Frank Miller, the Iowa cook, had transformed once again. He was no longer just a victim or a collaborator. He was an intelligence operative hidden in plain sight, his kitchen a nerve center of espionage. He just had to hope he could stay alive long enough to deliver his report. The stakes of his personal war had just been raised exponentially. Gathering intelligence gave Frank a secret purpose, but it didn't alleviate the daily gut-wrenching guilt of seeing his fellow prisoners starve. He knew he had to do more. He couldn't just watch them die. His position gave him access to the one thing they needed most: food. So he began a second, even riskier operation, one that could get him killed just as quickly as spying. He started small. While cleaning up after the officers' meals, he would wrap a few leftover rice balls or a piece of cooked fish in a leaf. Then, under the cover of darkness, he would sneak to the edge of the barracks and leave the small package in a pre-arranged hiding spot, a loose floorboard he'd identified earlier. It wasn't much, but for one starving man, it could be the difference between life and death. He had to choose who to help. He couldn't feed everyone. He focused on the sickest prisoners, the ones he saw fading the fastest. He quietly made contact with the American camp doctor, a man named Harris, and began a secret supply line. He would smuggle what he could, a bit of egg, some vegetables, and Harris would ensure it got to the men who were on the brink of death from malnutrition. This was a perilous dance of deception. He had to account for every scrap of food in the officers' pantry. The Japanese quartermaster was meticulous, so Frank became an expert at making food disappear. He would claim rats got into a sack of rice, or that a portion of fish had gone bad in the tropical heat. Every lie was a gamble with his life. But he didn't stop at smuggling. He began a campaign of subtle culinary sabotage. For the high-ranking officers like Tanaka, he cooked his best meals. Their health and good mood were essential for his cover. But for the lower-ranking, more brutal guards, the ones he saw tormenting prisoners, he had a special menu. He would use slightly spoiled ingredients in their food, not enough to cause serious poisoning, but enough to create discomfort. He would use extra grease, knowing it would cause stomach cramps. He learned which local roots had a mild laxative effect and would work them into the guards' stew. It was a petty, silent revenge, but it gave him immense satisfaction to see a particularly cruel guard doubled over the next day. These small acts of defiance began to subtly shift the perception of him among a select few. The doctor and the men who received the smuggled food knew the truth. They couldn't speak openly, but a quiet nod of acknowledgement or a softening of a hateful glare told Frank that his message was being received. He was still a pariah to most, but he was a silent hero to a few. One of those men was Sergeant Davis, the Marine who had hated him most openly. Davis was wasting away from dysentery when Dr. Harris began slipping him nutrient-rich egg custards that Frank had smuggled out. Slowly, miraculously, Davis began to regain some strength. One day, their eyes met across the compound. There was no smile, but the burning hatred was gone, replaced by a complex, grudging respect. Frank was now juggling 3 clandestine identities. To the Japanese, he was the obedient Chef Horio. To most prisoners, he was the fat collaborator. And to a secret few, he was a combination of spy, smuggler, and saboteur. The mental strain was immense. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, terrified of making a single mistake that could unravel his entire operation. He was waging a one-man war on multiple fronts. He was fighting the Japanese with espionage and sabotage, fighting the starvation of his men with smuggled food, and fighting his own conscience with every risky act of defiance. He had found his path to redemption, but it was a tightrope walk over a pit of fire, and the fall would be fatal. In early 1945, the atmosphere on the island began to change. The distant, percussive boom of artillery could be heard on the horizon, a sound that was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. American planes, once a rare sight, started appearing in the skies, conducting reconnaissance flights. For the prisoners, these were signs of hope, proof that they hadn't been forgotten. For the Japanese, they were omens of their impending doom. Commander Tanaka and his men grew increasingly tense and erratic. Their conversations in the mess hall, which Frank continued to monitor, were no longer about victories, but about defenses, retreats, and the honor of dying for the Emperor. The supply ships stopped coming altogether. Rations were cut for everyone, including Frank, though his portions remained far greater than those of the other prisoners. The day of liberation came suddenly and violently. The morning began with a deafening naval bombardment. Shells screamed overhead and exploded around the camp, sending everyone, prisoners and guards alike, diving for cover. Frank huddled in his kitchen hut, his heart pounding, praying that the shells would hit their targets and not the barracks full of his countrymen. After the bombardment lifted, the sounds of small arms fire grew closer. US Marines were storming the island. The Japanese guards, who had been brutal masters for so long, were now panicked and disorganized. Some tried to mount a futile defense. Others simply fled into the jungle. Commander Tanaka, true to his code, committed ritual suicide in his office. When the first American soldiers burst through the gates of Camp 3B, they were met with a scene from a nightmare. They found hundreds of men who were little more than living skeletons, their bodies ravaged by disease and starvation, but their eyes shining with the light of freedom. It was a moment of pure, raw emotion, tears, cheers, and the silent, overwhelming relief of survival. A young Marine captain, his face grim with shock and anger at the camp's condition, was directing the evacuation when one of his men called out, "Sir, you need to see this." They went to the officers' quarters and found the adjacent kitchen hut. Inside, they found Frank Miller. The contrast was sickeningly stark. The liberators saw a man who, while thin, was not emaciated. He was reasonably healthy, standing in a kitchen that, while basic, was well stocked compared to the rest of the camp. His clothes were worn, but not the rags of the other prisoners. To the battle-hardened Marines who had just witnessed the horrors of the barracks, the conclusion was immediate and obvious. They didn't see a survivor. They saw a collaborator. The captain's eyes narrowed with suspicion and contempt. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. Frank tried to explain, to tell them he was a prisoner, a cook from the USS Victory, but his words were drowned out by the optics of the situation. He looked like he had been living comfortably while his brothers died. He was not embraced as a fellow rescued American. He was shoved against a wall and treated as a potential enemy asset, a possible traitor. As the other prisoners were being gently helped onto stretchers and given chocolate and cigarettes, Frank was being interrogated, his story met with open disbelief and scorn. The moment of his long-awaited freedom was a moment of profound confusion and accusation. His liberation felt like a new kind of imprisonment. He had survived the Japanese, survived the starvation, survived the guilt and the constant fear of his secret operations. He had dreamed of this day for over a year, but now, surrounded by the faces of his saviors, he had never felt more alone or more misunderstood. His war was far from over. A new and perhaps more difficult battle was just beginning. The journey back to the United States was not the triumphant homecoming Frank had envisioned. He was kept separate from the other survivors, his status unclear. He wasn't a hero, but he wasn't officially a criminal either. He was an anomaly, a problem that the military bureaucracy needed to solve. When he finally set foot on American soil, it wasn't to a parade, but to a transfer to a military holding facility to await a court-martial. The charge was formally laid: collaboration with the enemy. The military prosecution painted a simple, damning picture. While his fellow Americans starved and died under brutal conditions, cook third-class Frank Miller accepted a deal to become the personal chef for the Japanese command. He received better food, better lodging, and protection, thereby giving aid and comfort to the enemy. Frank's defense attorney, a weary but dedicated public defender, argued that his actions were done under duress for the sole purpose of survival. But the prosecution had powerful ammunition. They brought in former prisoners from Camp 3B to testify against him. Men, still gaunt and bearing the physical and mental scars of their ordeal, took the stand and spoke of their anger and resentment. They described seeing Frank looking healthier while they wasted away. They called him Tanaka's pet and recounted how he was separate from them, living a life of privilege. Their testimony was emotional and compelling. To the military judges, it looked like an open and shut case of a man who sold out his countrymen for a full belly. Frank's future looked bleak. But then, Frank's defense called their own witnesses. The first was Dr. Harris, the camp physician. He testified under oath about the secret supply of smuggled food. He explained how Frank risked his life nightly to get nutrient-rich scraps to the sickest men, crediting the cook with directly saving the lives of at least a dozen prisoners who would have otherwise perished. The courtroom listened, stunned, as Dr. Harris described the secret operation. The narrative began to shift. This was no simple collaborator. This was something far more complex. The next witness to take the stand was Sergeant Davis, the tough Marine who had once despised Frank. His testimony was the turning point. Davis spoke in a low, powerful voice. He told the court how he was on the verge of death from dysentery and how the smuggled egg custards brought him back. "I hated him," Davis admitted, looking directly at the judges. "We all did. We saw him with the Japs, and we thought he was a traitor. We were wrong. He was fighting a different kind of war, and he was winning it." Finally, Frank's lawyer presented the evidence of his espionage. He brought out the collection of kitchen utensils from the hut, explaining the intricate system of notches and scratches. Naval intelligence officers, who had since debriefed Frank extensively, took the stand to confirm that the information he had gathered on shipping routes, fuel shortages, and island defenses was highly accurate and valuable. The court was now faced with a far more complicated reality. Frank Miller wasn't just a man who cooked for the enemy to survive. He was a man who used his unique position to wage a one-man campaign of smuggling, sabotage, and espionage. He had collaborated, yes, but he had leveraged that collaboration to save American lives and gather critical intelligence. The climax of the trial had arrived. The judges retreated to deliberate. Frank Miller's life and his honor were in their hands. Was he a traitor who got lucky, or was he an unconventional hero who made an impossible choice in an impossible situation? The final verdict would not only decide his fate, but would also define the very meaning of survival and duty in the crucible of war. In the end, the weight of the testimony from Dr. Harris and Sergeant Davis, combined with the verifiable intelligence Frank had collected, was too compelling to ignore. The court-martial acquitted Frank Miller of all charges of collaboration. Officially, he was cleared of wrongdoing, but the shadow of the trial and the collaborator label would linger with him for the rest of his days. The story of Frank Miller isn't a simple tale of right versus wrong or heroism versus treason. It's a messy, complicated, profoundly human story that lives in the gray areas. It reminds us that in the desperate circumstances of war, survival itself can become a form of resistance, and the choices men are forced to make defy easy judgment from the comfort of peacetime. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey. The past is filled with forgotten stories like Frank's that challenge us and make us think. So, we want to ask you, placed in that impossible situation, faced with slow starvation or a deal with the enemy, what choice do you think you would have made? Let us know in the comments below. If this story moved you or made you think, please show your support by hitting that like button and, if you haven't already, subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the forgotten corners of history. Your support allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light, ensuring that the lessons of the past are never truly lost. Thanks again for watching. We truly appreciate your time and curiosity. We'll see you in the next video.